find that founders, when they're open to it, it can be really useful to share as collateral so that you don't have to repeat yourself.
Awesome.
So yeah, you were just about to get into your story. Sorry.
Awesome. Yeah. So I started my journey around the beginning of the lockdown. I wanted to build something out of the cool ideas that my dad and I used to discuss. And I kind of started off with iOS app development, moved on to Flutter for like cross-platform, and then finally I kind of moved on to Python, and now I'm here at Rust for around like a year and a bit more. So I actually entered the open source space around a year and a half back. And that was with a tool called Electric. So what I was building for Electric was essentially a package management tool for Windows. Basically installs packages, right? You can do Electric install Zoom, and it does it in a non-interactive fashion, right? You just have one click install or like just one command install, right? And I built this open source. So like this was my first venture into open source. I built this tool for around 9 months. And kind of when it came to the launch date, I mean, that's what opened my eyes about about open source. So when I was building Electric, I had this assumption, or I made this assumption that building in public means you get discovered automatically. Like discovery and scaling open source project takes place automatically. But what I realized was like during my launch day, and by the way, this was like kind of really early in my journey. So I was begging and pleading for stars which was like some sort of validation towards what I was building. And like, don't get me wrong, right? I spent a lot of time on the tool. It was actually quite good in the sense that like I had a package registry set up, I have a website, I had auto update scripts that used to run every day, etc. So I was like full in on the product. I spent a lot of time perfecting it. And at the end of the day, like during launch day, I was expecting like for it to become like 5,000, 10,000 stars as an open source project, right? Because as I put in a lot of effort into it, I expected it to grow much faster than what actually it did, right? So when it came to like the launch day, first problem I actually faced was, hey, as a new developer, I haven't launched anything before. How do I launch an open source project, right? So I read a few blogs. So a few people say, hey, it's good to post it on Hashnode, it's good to post it on dev.to, it's good to post it on Reddit, right? And the post that I did was actually on Reddit. It got around 200 upvotes in the Python community, but that wasn't enough to get a sizable number of users using my tool. And it was not because of the tool itself, but rather the fact that I wasn't able to bring out my tool into the public, right? And I'm also co-founder of this community called Builder Group, and we are over 2,000 Gen Z builders. And I've been seeing this recurring pattern of developers building some incredible tooling, but they just aren't discovered, right? Like people just make the assumption that building in public means discovery takes place automatically. And that's not what happened. So I've been noticing this a lot. And most recently, actually, a few months back, we spent just over a week building a tool called Fleet. And Fleet is a tool that speeds up Rust compile times using like a bunch of optimizations already existing like in the ecosystem. And with the 9 days of work, we reached around, I mean, we are actively at more than 2,000 stars, right? And what that opened my eyes up to is that it's really important for you to have a great tool, but it's also really important for you to know where to promote it, what projects are going to take off, right? Because project discovery today is very, very unpredictable, especially for open source projects. And you're not being discovered where you're building. Now, another huge problem I've noticed is that there is like for building an open source project, keep in mind that an open source developer typically is someone who's doing this as a hobby, right? Like they don't have too much time to dedicate to it, or they just don't have the capital or all the resources. And what they end up doing is they end up having to learn or have expertise in multiple different platforms, right? For example, if I wanted to build a community, let's say that I wanted to build a community. Okay, yeah. So I want a community around my project. I want to have blogs and content being written so that my project is discovered. I want to raise capital. I want to like for my project, right? I want to grow my team. I want to handle deployments. All of these different things end up having to be done by a small team of developers or just one solo developer. And it's important for you to know how to use these different tools to the best of their extent to actually have a big impact, right? So what I noticed was that building open source today means that your discovery is unpredictable unless you're already very established in the open source space. And building is also quite tough because you need to know how to use multiple different tools to actually build a community and create content around your open source project. And that led me to partnering up with Varun. I met Varun in a hackathon, and that led me to partnering up with him to actually build what Dimension is today. So if it's cool with you, I'd love to show you the deck and kind of what we have to give you a better view of what we're building.
Yes, absolutely.
Awesome.
I love the problem domain because, yeah, a lot of developers figure this out too late.
Yeah, I mean, I spent 9 months on this, right? And I don't want other developers to also face the same issues because it can be really demotivating for open source developers to basically spend a lot of time building something and just end up not having any user base or any discovery. So, oh, sorry. So I mean, I'm actually on a new Mac, so it wants me to restart Zoom to be able to share screen. Is that cool?
Yeah, if you want, you can just drop out and come back in.
Awesome. Thank you.
I'm just gonna share my screen for whoever's recording. Well, that was
Awesome.
super fast. Nice.
Sweet. So let me show you what we're building. So what we're building at Dimension is an ecosystem that has unified developer tooling and product discoverability, and it puts that on top. Now, a typical open source project, as I already previously mentioned, requires you to know how to use multiple different tools across multiple different spaces, right? You have project management tooling, you have blogs and content through which you can educate people or build tutorials on your open source project. If you're building a library, for example, you have deployment that takes place on these multiple different platforms. You have fundraising that happens on these different platforms. You have social updates in which you likely have to use multiple of these different tools together to build a community. And finally, you have source code management that happens on GitHub. And what you notice over here is that an open source team or open source developers who are limited on time and resources need to learn how to use so many different tools. And that's really challenging for developers who don't have like a full-time job, or I mean, so who like don't have their whole day to actually spend building their open source product, right? Now, what we notice over here is that developer tooling today is fragmented, and product discovery and like product discoverability is very unpredictable, right? And if you have tooling which is across so many different spaces, it makes it really hard to get discovered. It makes it hard to measure engagement, to deploy software, to communicate, to scale products, right? Because you have an overhead of these of many different platforms, and everything is so fragmented that you don't know how to use each of their different tools to the best of their extent. So building together just becomes a nightmare for open source teams or solo open source developers building open source software. And what we're building is a whole new dimension for developers, which essentially has unified tooling and product discovery to essentially create an open source experience that is very rewarding as it is quite convenient and powerful for open source teams and developers. So you might ask, look, so you're building Dimension, but I don't want to move away from GitHub, right? Because GitHub's source code management tooling is fantastic. There's nothing wrong with it. And I also don't want to change my development workflow to join Dimension. So Dimension is essentially built on GitHub. It's an ecosystem for open source built on GitHub. And what we have different from GitHub is that we have real-time collaborative project management. As you also noticed, I mean, GitHub project beta is still rolling out, but I've seen a lot of the developers I've spoken to still have negative feedback, which leads them to use different tooling like Linear or Notion for the open source projects. You also have a real-time social feed, real-time developer content creation in which open source teams can collaborate to create blogs and content together, which is not possible today in a real-time fashion. You also have project marketing that takes place in which you can market your open source project, right? And this is for commercial open source. If they have a budget, they want to showcase it to developers, that's something they can do. You have project discovery. And finally, this is a future vision, which is unified, powerful cloud developer tooling to basically prevent developers from having to use multiple different platforms for building their software. So here's what Dimension would look like. You have source code management that is built on GitHub. Every change you make on Dimension is synced with GitHub. So there's no moving away from GitHub, except you're just using Dimension as a new interface for GitHub. Now you also have release planning, you have to-dos, all possible through real-time project management. We also, I mean, if you notice in this picture we have here, we have real-time cursors as well, right? So when I mean real-time, it's truly real-time, because I've seen many different project management tools that don't even show you which users are on the page and still claim to have a real-time experience. Our experience is superior to most tools out there. And what makes us different is that we're also able to achieve latencies of sub 30 milliseconds on most kind of for most countries and kind of places across the world, which allows for just more seamless collaboration to take place. Now, this is also paired with one-click deployment, through which you just have one click and it's instantly deployed on the web. Let's say you have a Next.js app that you want to deploy on the web. With Dimension, you just have one click and it's boom, like you get a link off that. However, if you want to use a different platform today, let's take Vercel, for example. You have to join Vercel by authenticating with GitHub. You have to select your repository. You have to select the framework, and then you have to deploy it, right? And for any further deployments, to check the status, you have to go to a different platform to monitor that. With Dimension, it's just one click. You just click one button, and since we already have access to your open source repository, it's very, very convenient, and it's truly a one-click experience. Now you also have collaborative roadmaps, which is again paired with the Kanban to essentially create a really nice experience. And finally, we also have fundraising, through which you can basically you can show people that you're raising capital for your open source project where you're being discovered. Because what you notice with GitHub today is that most projects are actually using Open Collective as a platform for basically raising some sort of capital, right? And what I've noticed is that a lot of people are actually looking at your GitHub project page, but they aren't looking at your Open Collective page, because Open Collective is not built for discovery. It's rather built as a platform for you to raise capital. So you should be, so people should be aware that you're raising capital where you're actually building. Now, this brings us to the feed, right? Which is how we try to accelerate discovery open source projects. Now, this is not a standard feed that you would expect from like any other like company. What we're building is a feed focused on open source. And what's unique about our feed algorithm is that it's able to analyze what repositories or like what technologies you're building with, what frameworks you're using, what libraries you're using, and it's able to recommend recommendations based off what you're building with. So it's not just random recommendations or vague recommendations based off the based off, for example, let's say I'm using Rust, it can just suggest any new Rust project. What we're doing is we're able to understand in detail what you're building with. And this is already an algorithm that we have developed and is able to understand exactly what dependencies you're using, exactly what framework you're using, etc. Now, this is also paired with training projects and developers, through which you can, again, discover really amazing developers who you can also connect with, unlike what you have with GitHub, in which there's no way to connect with a developer that you find building really cool things. And finally, you also have live brainstorming sessions. And how I believe this would be a great experience for open source developers is that when people are building new software or a new release, for example, they want to understand exactly what these developers want in the next release, right? Like what features they want. And by joining a brainstorming session, you just join a session, you speak to the community. And the beauty of this is that, let's say that, for example, someone recommends a cool feature in chat. Because we're so integrated, you can just drag and drop the feature from chat into your project management. It's that simple. Now, here's what we have so far. This deck is, I mean, this slide of the deck is slightly outdated. I'll explain why. But more than that, we have Fleet. So we ourselves believe in building open source and basically allowing other developers to benefit from the tooling that we're building inside Dimension. Fleet was built out of the problem that we faced, which is that Rust compile times are slow, but there's different ways to speed it up. And a lot of developers out there don't know that these are different ways to speed it up. So Fleet currently has over 2,000 stars. Volt is actually a work in progress package manager that's able to install packages 30x faster. And this is kind of compared to NPM or Yarn. Now, we also have some incredible projects joining the platform. And this list is actually outdated because today I spoke to the creator of Tabler, and they have, and as an organization, they have over 38,000 stars for their repositories. And they have agreed to join our private beta to check out what we're building. We also have Starship, SolidJS, and some incredible communities who are also joining us to essentially benefit from the great tooling that we provide for our private beta, and to essentially help us find out how we can improve Dimension and how we can reiterate over it really quickly. And some of the people looking at our repositories, including engineers from Google, Apple, Tesla, Shopify, PayPal, etc. Now, where we see ourselves standing over here is really focused on tooling and discovery, right? If you look at deployment platforms, you have kind of Vercel, for example, they have some great tooling, but there's no discovery. But if you have blogs and content, which has some great discovery, but there's a lack of tooling. So we believe that that's really a one platform where you can build and be discovered at the same time. Now, our target is 1 million active developers by Q2 2023. And obviously, this is ambitious, but we believe that the primary way we can actually scale this is by word of mouth, because we believe that our experiences that we'll be able to build or provide open source teams joining our private beta would hopefully be so good that they would like to share it with other open source maintainers in the space. Now, how we plan to generate revenue is through sponsored ads on the social feed. Again, this is for commercial open source projects. And the beauty of this is that commercial open source projects are able to target very specific developers. If it's, for example, Tailwind, right? Like if you look at Tailwind, you probably want to target Next.js developers, React developers, etc. Right? And you'll be able to do that through Dimension. However, like other platforms don't understand what you're building with in such a precise fashion. You also have enterprise listings, in which a growing thing I'm seeing is that people are being hired to build open source full time from companies like Netlify, Vercel, and this could be something that enterprise would be interested in kind of posting on the feed. And finally, tooling subscriptions for the deployment platform, for example, project management above a certain limit, etc. So what we have over here is a very diverse set of ways to generate revenue. It's not only focused on the open source projects, it's more focused on commercial open source projects, as well as corporations who want to market on the social feed, as well as enterprise listings. So we're not completely dependent on open source projects or open source teams, since we do understand that they are most of the time limited on capital. How we plan to go to market is through collaborations, sponsorships with some great YouTubers, example, Fireship. We also have hackathons that we host on Dimension. So people are building on Dimension, and that's obviously facilitated by the fact that we have real-time tooling, referral incentives, merchandise badges, and freebies. And why we believe we have the competitive advantage is because we have an unparalleled ecosystem, because Dimension's ecosystem is as powerful as it is convenient to build on. We already have 60% of the platform built, keeping us well ahead of any potential competition. And finally, we also have some support from some great open source communities, as I previously shared with you. And our future vision is to essentially become the place to build open source. We want to make GitHub essentially the Skype for building open source, and we want to be the Discord for open source, is how I'd like to position Dimension. It's the new way to build open source while still integrating everything with your GitHub workflows. And the future would be an extensive cloud platform with Dimension Cloud and contribution rewards for open source, which would include kind of bounties, potentially even ownership in open source projects, etc. Our team, here's our amazing team. I'm Tejas. I built multiple different tools. I'm also co-founder Builder Group, as I previously mentioned. My co-founder is Varun, and he has over 3.5 years of experience building software. We have Savio, who has over 50,000 followers on Twitter. He's a developer advocate at Dimension. And finally, I have Jeffrey, and he manages communities with over 800,000 members on Discord. So he's our community manager. And here are our amazing advisors. We have Asad Khan, CEO of Lambda with over 1 million active users. He is also verbal committed to Czech. We have Amit Jain, who's founder at Zamfi. He was ex-MD at Sigma Capital and ex-head at Uber Asia Pacific. And Sayan Ghosh, who is a VC investor at IFC, who's also evaluating us currently. And also most recently, Kunal Bisla, who has 7 years of experience at Netflix, 3 at Robinhood. He's also verbal committed to Czech. And yeah, that's kind of pretty much it. And I'd love to answer any questions and get your thoughts and your advice on this.
That was an amazing pitch. You've done this a lot, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, to be honest, this is actually something that I'm really passionate about in terms of what we're building. So honestly, like what I'm telling you is not just something that's rehearsed. It's honestly what I believe in. And I faced like 9 months of just of kind of me not being rewarded for the work I put in for my open source contributions, and me believing something that was actually not true, which I still believe should be true. And I've noticed that so many other developers are doing something like this. And like a fun fact, actually, Fleet was inspired by an open source project called Cargo RAM Disk, and it had 5 stars. So we were able to essentially blow up something which had a similar idea to 2,000 stars with the right amount of effort, right? And we believe that it's really important for developers to be discovered for the open source contributions, because there's nothing less demotivating than just not having anyone look at or even use your tools.
Yep. Okay. I have some questions that I'll ask after we stop the recording. But one thing I wanted to understand, and when this is a problem with early stage investing, how much of this is built versus how much is in just in Figma right now? So I know you have the algorithm worked out. What else is built already?
So we have most of the backend built actually. We have project management that we're currently working on. It's a big challenge because of the fact that we obviously have animations and stuff that obviously there's like a missing of states, and we're building for offline first. So that's also a big challenge. So real time is something that's taking us a fair amount of time. Our complete backend is built in Rust. Our feed algorithm, as well as our actual feed backend, our feed APIs are built in Rust. We're using kind of like Red Panda, so we can handle 4 million events a second. So we're really building this for scalability, because we believe that developers would be using this like a fair bit. And our approach for this is actually building a great, so obviously what we're building over here is an ecosystem. I'm also working on the deployment platform right now, the one-click deployments. The backend is already done. We're actually connecting it to a Kubernetes cluster right now, so that we can kind of figure out auto scaling and things like that. But to be honest, most of the backend is done, and we actually have a few other interns working with us, all Gen Zs, by the way, who are also building with us. And they are kind of just working with us, and they're also chipping in different parts as well. So we're also making progress through that.
Got it. Okay. It's pretty impressive. Okay. Yeah, I'll pause the recording here because I have like some more sort of specific questions, but that was amazing. And I hope that this video can be used to send to people to save some time, but this is really impressive. Okay, right, I'll pause.